Hello, and welcome to Armstrong's Laboratory, the channel that breaks down and reviews academic papers. In today's video, we are looking at the work of some scientists out of New York in their recent study titled Suicidal Subtypes, Stress Responsivity, and Impulsive Aggression. In this paper, the researchers were looking at the connections between the HPA axis, impulse, aggression, and suicide attempters. Some suicide researchers subscribe to the stress diathesis model of suicide. The stress diathesis model of suicide states that there are genetic factors that play a role in a person's ability to cope with stress. Suicidal individuals are thought to have a lower resilience to stressful life events compared to a neurotypical individual. By being exposed to stressful life events, this may lead to a hyperactivity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the body stress pathway. This is also called the HPA axis. This overactivation may lead susceptible individuals to develop disorders such as suicidality. HPA axis dysregulation is measured in 4 different ways: baseline cortisol levels, cortisol output in response to a stressor, cortisol responsivity in response to a stressor, and stress responsivity in response to pharmacological interventions. Some studies have shown that there is an elevated baseline level of cortisol, while other studies have shown there are no difference in suicide victims. One way in which researchers assess stress is through the Trier social stress test. This test measures the total output of cortisol and its responsivity in response to stressors. Examples of stressors in this test include being asked to give an impromptu presentation and using mental arithmetic. Blood samples are collected through an IV during the test, and saliva samples are collected as well. Multiple researchers have used stress paradigms to study suicidal behaviors with rather conflicting results. One study that used the Trier social stress test found that there was decreased cortisol output in suicidal individuals compared to neurotypical individuals. Another study that used the Maastricht Acute stress test, which uses a cold compress and more mental arithmetic to induce a stress response. One particular study using this stress paradigm found that suicidal attempters had lower baseline cortisol levels compared to a neurotypical individual. Interestingly, though, with the same test, suicidal individuals who had not attempted suicide had similar baseline cortisol levels compared to a neurotypical individual. Another study using the Trier social stress test showed higher baseline cortisol levels in suicidal individuals compared to neurotypical ones. So 4 different tests are telling us 4 different things. The researchers in this study hypothesized that these studies did not account for depressed individuals, which may have varied their results. The author in this paper hypothesized that HPA axis activity may differ in subset of suicidal individuals. These researchers think that suicidal people can be grouped into stress-responsive individuals and non-stress responsive individuals. The stress-responsive group is thought to be more influenced by psychosocial stressors, are more likely to respond to stressors with suicidal thinking, and are typically more impulsive and aggressive. Individuals who are proactive with their aggression are thought to be the non-stress responsive group. Both impulsivity and aggression are thought to be associated with suicidal behavior and HPA axis dysfunction. The paper defines impulsiveness as spontaneous, poorly planned, or situationally inappropriate behavior. Aggression can either be premeditative or impulsive in nature. One study showed that individuals who were high in reactive aggression had increased baseline cortisol levels compared to those with deliberate and non-aggression, which had neurotypical baseline levels of cortisol. In this particular studies, the researchers used the Trier social stress test to assess cortisol level in suicidal individuals. In this cohort, they distinguished groups first based on mood disorder suicide attempters and mood disorder non-suicide attempters. Next, they distinguished individuals into one of 4 groups: high aggression, high impulsivity, high aggression, low impulsivity, low aggression, high impulsivity, and low aggression and low impulsivity. Impulsivity and aggression were measured using the Barrett Impulsivity Scale and the Brown-Goodwin Lifetime History of Aggressive Behavior test. They can then measure their baseline levels of cortisol, their total cortisol output, and their cortisol reactivity. The results showed that the baseline cortisol levels were similar between the non-attempter group and the attempter group. During the Trier social stress test, the total level of cortisol output was similar as well. The only difference was seen between the non-attempter and the attempter group was cortisol reactivity, but this difference was not statistically significant. This data is more or less easily explained when the attempter group is broken down into the 4 groups we discussed earlier. When comparing the non-attempter group to the various combinations of aggression and impulsivity, we do not see that many differences. In the baseline cortisol group, no difference was seen between any of the groups. The same was true for the total cortisol output during the social stress test. The only significant difference was seen in the reactivity to cortisol for the high aggression and high impulsivity group. Now, before we go into the implications for this data, I want to discuss a few things. First, you're probably asking yourself, why didn't they include a psychiatric control who didn't suffer from a mood disorder? And honestly, I don't know. I can't think of a good reason, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the authors. I'm sure they had a reason for it, but I think some things were lost in the paper when they didn't include this group. Although they did mention this as a limitation later in the study, which was nice to see. I think it would have also been nice to see the non-attempter group divided based on impulsivity and aggression as well, but we didn't get that in this study. But I didn't run the study, so there's that. Anyways, let's look at the implications for the results. So to my knowledge, at least, and to the author's knowledge, this was the first study to subtype suicidal patients by aggression and impulsivity and compare it to baseline cortisol levels, cortisol output, and reactivity levels. The researchers hope the study can differentiate suicidal patients who are stress responsive and non-stress responsive. It seems the study at hand supports a variety of studies that are out there right now, but also contradicts a lot of them. The reason why some of the data did not line up with the others remain unclear, and again, this may be due to the diagnosis of depression and some of the studies not being taken into account. One study has shown that individuals with a hyperactive cortisol response are more likely to have a history of suicide ideation. This seems to be supportive of the current data in the study, particularly in the high aggression and the high impulsivity group. The researchers have hypothesized that this group, who is more reactive to cortisol, may be more reactive to environmental stressors, while individuals who are less reactive to stressors have a normal cortisol response. This study shows that there may be a relationship between cortisol reactivity and suicidality may be based on aggression and impulsivity. Really, the study is just adding to the rather conflicting evidence regarding the HPA axis in suicidal patients. But this may be important moving forward, particularly for treatment, as this shows that the biology of suicide may differ in suicidal patients itself. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you learned something. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe down to the channel below. I post videos weekly that go over different academic papers, so be on the lookout for future content. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll be more than happy to answer them. If you're looking for more information surrounding the topic, be sure to check out my other videos.